to see you all. My name is Blake Gudgel. I'm with KluraLabs. Um, and if anyone's heard about antimicrobials, what are they and why are they important? They've been around for quite some time. Most of them are active ingredient additives that are put into products to basically try and make products active on their own without spraying them or treating them against bacteria, mold, viruses. Um, oh, did I jump forward several? I'll leave this up. So there's many different types. I guess this is my background and story. About 20 years ago, I licensed my first technology. Wasn't looking for antimicrobials. I was lucky enough to get to work on DARPA's $100 million revolutionizing prosthetics program. And so one of the applications we licensed was a super hydrophobic nanotechnology to help protect the socket environment inside what encases the residual limb to keep it healthy, because the leading cause, 90% of amputation in the world, is diabetic ulcers. And so that was my first step into it. Then 10 years later and 10 years ago, I was brought back to my alma mater to run the tech transfer office for the University of Oklahoma, where, like most universities, we had research going on and licensing around silver technology. So there's a $60 billion additives market for antimicrobials. Silver makes up most of it. So yeah, I've touched this twice over the last 20 years. And then about 2.5 years ago, some venture capitalists from Silicon Valley reached out saying they were looking for a CEO for an investment they were wanting to make in antimicrobials. And my initial inclination was, I'm not going to be interested because though I've touched it and watched it over the last 20 years, there's now a lot of literature about the environmental problems, and also most of them are not really effective in the final product. So I said, I'll make another investor friend. I'll help you guys do some diligence and probably steer you away from it. And as I got into the diligence, I saw their third-party independent validation and hitting peak levels that were 4 or 5 times higher than what I had seen in the market before. Speeds that were 60 seconds instead of hours. And so I'll get into why that matters here in just a little bit. So I did jump in. At the end of the day, and we'll talk about the end one later. This is more on this part of the story. So copper or silver, it can be quite active on its own, but by the time you cram it into a product, usually what you have is a product with antimicrobial ingredients, not necessarily an antimicrobial product. Here's some examples of silver leaching into the groundwater, harming the wildlife, harming the plants, the ecosystems, but also now contributing to antimicrobial resistance. And here's where I'm going to camp out for a little bit, is taking a linear approach of, let me take an active ingredient and cram it into a product is just a really hard approach on this, when this is actually a systems environment. So even on efficacy, you need to focus on the intended use, right? So for example, a medical glove, right? It needs to work really, really fast, right? An hour to activate peak activation just isn't fast enough. In textiles, you need it to last 50 washes and also not leach into the groundwater, right? So efficacy on its own means very different things than spectrum. Are we targeting fungus for food life protection, or are we targeting bacterias in the hospital systems, hospital-acquired infections? Those are all different mechanisms of action. The regulatory landscape, safety looks different for each one of those. Then you get into compatibility. Can you actually make it work without compromising the physical properties of the original product its own? And then at the end of the day, if you want it to be commercially viable, you have to do all of this while making it economically viable. And at the end of the day, there's just not a silver bullet. Yeah, this is just one example of one of the pilots that we've been running to work on extending the shelf life of produce. And like I said, on this, we're targeting mold versus hospital-acquired infections with medical gloves. So at the end of the day, I'm just going to camp out here. When I jumped in, I was like, all right, how are they able to do this? Well, the two co-founders in the UK just took a different approach. They said, we're not going to focus on ingredients. That's just too hard. You can't make a silver bullet. There's not going to be a magic ingredient. So They actually just focused on really elegant surface chemistry. So one example, we just launched some antimicrobial medical gloves in the EU and hoping to roll out in the US in Q2 with FDA approval. We don't add an active ingredient at all. So there's already calcium in that process. You take a mannequin hand called a former, dips into a coagulant tank first, and then it dips into a nitrile tank, and then just goes through a series of ovens. So what they did was they basically said a lot of these ingredients are already here, but calcium can't penetrate the cell walls to even have its effect. But once inside the cell wall, it's far more effective than the harsher chemical alternatives that are toxic for the environment and carry real safety issues. So they were able to basically focus on, all right, through the vulcanization process, how can we make this a new structure on the surface of the glove? And they created what's called a polymer ionophoric complex, where you have groups of carboxylic acid groups holding calcium ions. When the bacteria land, the carboxylic acid groups can penetrate the cell walls and then release the calcium ions. And now you've got something that's safe, but extremely effective, right? So the best analogy for this is baking bread, which I don't do often, but it's all the same ingredients, whether you're making a French loaf with a really hard crust on it or a pancake, right? Two very different surfaces, same ingredients. It's just differences in the variations of those ingredients and the time and temperature of the cooking, right? So that's actually where a lot of our work was done, was optimizing the time and temperature to lock in that crust. So I think that we're onto something. Really, it's the co-founders and our brilliant scientists that are onto something that's really focusing on intended use of a product first, and then working within the constraints of the system environment. We're starting with gloves. We're rolling out the food packaging where we've extended shelf life by 7 days in soft fruit. And we launched here some of our textiles, the cop shirts and the extreme hangout shirts have our textiles formulations in it. So there's a lot more to do and unlock, but I think the newest innovation from this team is really just a different approach that's not predicated on a single magic ingredient, but really working within the systems environment, focused on the product's intended use.